San Francisco, Kalifornien, Chinatown, 26. November 1964, Donnerstagnachmittag, 3:12 Uhr, Los Angeles, July 1972. The Olympic Auditorium, a concrete monolith built in the 1920s, a venue that had hosted everything from Olympic boxing trials to professional wrestling. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the ring was gone. In its place was a single expansive tatami mat laid out over the hard floor. The air conditioning was broken, and the midsummer California heat was trapped inside the cavernous space, mixing with the smell of sweat, cedar wood, and liniment. 500 people sat in the folded wooden bleacher. This was not a crowd of casual fans. There were no cheering sections, no souvenir program. This was a gathering of the most serious, most obsessive martial artists in Southern California. So there were instructors from Japanese dojos in Little Tokyo, Korean taekwondo masters, Filipino eskrima specialists, and a scattering of traditional boxers who had been quietly invited to see something extraordinary. They sat in absolute silence. The only sound in the auditorium, the low hum of the industrial fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They were waiting for Steven Seagal. At 20 years old, Steven Seagal was already a myth in the making, a physical anomaly that defied the standard laws of martial arts physiology. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed around 230 pounds. He wasn't just big, he was dense, built with the heavy, solid musculature of a man raised on rigid Japanese training methods. He had spent years in Japan, living in dojos, absorbing aikido, with a ferocity that frightened his Japanese peers. They called him a prodigy, but behind his back, they called him something else. They called him dangerous. Seagal's demonstration began at exactly 10 a.m. He stepped onto the mat wearing a traditional black hakama and a crisp white jai top. He didn't bow to the crowd. He didn't smile. He simply looked at his 3 yukis, his training partners, and nodded. What followed was 30 minutes of controlled, devastating violence. Aikido is often misunderstood by the public as a gentle art of harmony and redirection, a dance of flowing circles. Seagal did not practice it that way. When his partners attacked, Seagal's wrist locks were applied with a snapping sudden that made the bones in their forearms grind audibly. When he threw them, they didn't fall gracefully, and they were launched into the air, hitting the mat with sickening thuds that echoed through the silent auditorium. He used his massive weight not to gently guide his opponents, but to shatter their balance with the impact of a moving vehicle. A 200-pound black belt would charge at Seagal with a committed strike. Seagal would step offline, his hands moving like striking snakes, catching the wrist and elbow. A sudden, violent rotation of his hips, and the attacker was airborne, crashing into the wooden base of the bleachers. The crowd watched in stunned silence. It wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying. It was a raw demonstration of absolute physical dominance. When Seagal finished, his chest was barely heaving. He stood in the center of the mat, his 3 yukis groaning on the floor around him, clutching their joints. Now the audience sat paralyzed. They had just witnessed a level of aikido that bordered on brutality. Seagal wiped a single drop of sweat from his forehead, turned to face the bleachers, and allowed himself a thin, arrogant smile. He knew exactly what effect he had just created. He was the biggest, the most technically proficient, and the most dangerous man in the room. Then, a man leaning against the brick wall near the emergency exit, an older Japanese aikido instructor who had traveled from Osaka just to watch, whispered something to the teenager standing next to him. The teenager's eyes went wide, and he pointed toward the 3rd row. Seagal followed the boy's finger. In the 3rd row, sitting perfectly still among a group of older Chinese martial artists, was a man who looked entirely out of place. He was small, perhaps 5'7", weighing no more than 135 pounds. He was wearing a plain, dark gray wool jacket, despite the stifling heat in the auditorium. His hair was long, pulled back tightly. He wasn't looking at the mat. He was looking at the floor, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked like a student, a bystander, someone who had wandered in off the street to escape the sun. Steven Seagal knew exactly who it was. Everyone in the martial arts world knew who it was. It was Bruce Lee. Lee was in Los Angeles filming post-production work, but his presence in the martial arts community was a constant, silent pressure. He was the man who was systematically dismantling the traditional martial arts establishment, telling magazines that classical styles were dead, that rigid forms were useless in a real fight. Seagull, a man who had dedicated his life to the absolute purity of a classical style, represented everything Bruce Lee publicly despised. Seagull's thin smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He didn't view Bruce Lee as an equal. He viewed him as a philosopher, an actor, a man who talked a big game, but lacked the physical mass to back it up against a real fighter. Seagull stepped off the mat, walking directly toward the third row. The crowd parted for him, sensing the shift in the room's energy. 500 people stopped breathing. Seagull stopped at the railing, looking down at the small man in the dark jacket. Lee didn't look up. He didn't move. He just sat there, a statue of calm. For a long moment, Seagull said nothing. He just looked down, letting his towering frame cast a shadow over Lee. Then, loud enough for the entire auditorium to hear, Seagull spoke. His voice was deep, laced with condescension and challenge. "I've heard a lot of talk from you, Lee. A lot of theories about forms being dead. A lot of talking about what works and what doesn't." Seagull paused, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "But talking isn't fighting. Step out onto that mat. Stand against me for 30 seconds, and I'll call you Master." A ripple of shocked gasps moved through the bleachers. It was a profound insult masked as a compliment. In aikido, 30 seconds of continuous, full resistance fighting against a master of Seagull's size was virtually impossible. If Lee tried to punch him, Seagull would break his arm. If Lee tried to grapple, Seagull would throw him into the ceiling. Seagull was offering Lee a public execution, disguised as a test. Bruce Lee finally looked up, his dark eyes, devoid of any visible anger, locked onto Seagull's. He didn't stand up immediately. He just stared, reading the massive man in front of him, analyzing the arrogance, the stiffness in his posture, the psychological need to dominate. Lee saw everything he needed to see in 3 seconds. Lee slowly uncrossed his legs and stood up. He was almost a foot shorter than Seagull. He didn't take off his wool jacket. He didn't stretch. He didn't adjust his stance. He simply looked up at the giant and said one word, "All right?" The silence in the Olympic Auditorium became a physical weight. Seagull turned on his heel and walked back to the center of the tatami mat. He took his stance, his weight dropped low, his hands open, his hips squared. He was a mountain of defensive capability, ready to intercept any attack and shatter the attacker's structure. Bruce Lee walked down the aisle, stepped onto the edge of the mat, and stopped exactly 10 feet away from Seagull. He didn't adopt a traditional martial arts stance. He stood sideways, his lead foot slightly turned, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He looked relaxed, almost bored. They stared at each other. 500 people watched. Nobody moved. Seagull broke the stillness. He couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, his right hand shooting out not to punch, but to grab Lee's lead wrist. This was the foundation of aikido. Once you control the wrist, you control the entire body. What happened next took exactly 7 seconds. But to the 500 people watching, it felt like an hour. Second one, Seagull's massive hand closed on empty air. As his fingers reached for Lee's wrist, Lee's arm simply wasn't there. Lee had shifted his entire body a fraction of an inch to the outside angle. And it wasn't a dramatic dodge. It was an economic displacement. Seagull's hand grabbed nothing but the hot California air inside the auditorium. A flicker of confusion crossed Seagull's face. Second two, realizing he had missed the grab, Seagull instinctively transitioned. He didn't pull back. In aikido, you never retreat. He rotated his hips, using the momentum of his missed grab to spin into a devastating backhand strike aimed directly at the side of Lee's head. If it connected, it would end the demonstration instantly. Lee didn't block the strike. He leaned back exactly 2 inches. Seagull's knuckles sliced through the space where Lee's jaw had been, the wind from the punch ruffling Lee's collar. Second three. Seagull was now slightly overcommitted on the spin. His back was partially exposed for a millisecond. Any other fighter would have tried to capitalize with a hook or a tackle. Lee did neither. He simply stepped forward, placing himself directly inside Seagull's guard. chest to chest. Seagull was suddenly too close to use his long limbs. His aikido techniques, designed for mid-range and long-range interception, were rendered useless in the close-quarters clinch. Second 4, Seagull tried to muscle out. He dropped his weight, trying to use his superior mass to push Lee backward and recreate the distance he needed. As he pushed, his arms came down to Lee's shoulders. Lee's hands moved. They didn't strike, they touched. Lee's right palm gently rested on Seagull's left elbow. His left palm lightly touched Seagull's right wrist. It looked like a lover's embrace, but the placement was biomechanically absolute. Lee wasn't blocking Seagull's push. He was guiding it, redirecting the massive energy of the 230-pound man into the floor. Second 5, Seagull felt his power vanish. He was pushing with all his strength, his legs driving, but his body wasn't moving forward. It was being subtly pulled downward and to the side. His center of gravity, which he had spent 20 years perfecting, was completely hijacked. Panic began to claw at the edges of Seagull's mind. He tried to jerk his arms back to reset, but Lee's hands were stuck to him like glue, moving perfectly in sync with his struggle. Second 6, Lee executed a slight, almost invisible shift of his hip. It wasn't a throw, it was an anatomical manipulation. Using the principles of Wing Chun sensitivity and his own Jeet Kune Do physics, Lee amplified Seagull's off-balance state. He didn't fight the giant's strength, but he became a conduit for it. Seagull's own pushing force was redirected back into his own spine. His knees buckled involuntarily. Second 7. As Seagull's head dropped slightly due to his buckling knees, Bruce Lee's right hand left the giant's elbow. It traveled in a straight, vertical line up the center of Lee's own body, stopping exactly 1 millimeter above Seagull's throat. At the exact same time, Lee's left foot swept backward, not with force, but with perfect timing, catching Seagull's planted front ankle. Steven Seagal hit the tatami mat like a collapsing building. The sound was deafening in the silent auditorium. 230 pounds of solid mass slamming into the hardwood floor beneath the tatami. The impact knocked the wind out of Seagull's lungs in a violent rush. He landed flat on his back, his legs tangled, on his arms splayed out. And then, absolute stillness. Seagull lay on the floor, staring up at the industrial steel beams of the Olympic Auditorium ceiling. His chest was paralyzed. His diaphragm had locked from the shock of the impact. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His hands slowly, instinctively, came up to his throat, hovering right where Bruce Lee's fingertips had been a microsecond before he fell. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with primal animalistic terror. He never saw the strike. He never saw the sweep. He didn't even understand how he had ended up on the floor. One moment, he was pushing with all his might, feeling invincible. The next, he was on his back, fighting for air, staring at the ceiling, knowing with absolute certainty that if Bruce Lee had wanted to, he would never have taken another breath. Bruce Lee stood exactly where Seagull had fallen. He hadn't moved forward. He hadn't celebrated. He just stood there, his hands returned to his sides, looking down at the massive man on the floor with an expression of absolute neutrality. 500 people did not make a sound. Nobody cheered. Nobody gasped. They just stared, their minds struggling to process the physics of what they had just witnessed. A man who weighed 135 pounds had just put a 230-pound aikido prodigy on the floor in 7 seconds, without throwing a single punch, without throwing a single kick. He had used Seagull's own aggressive energy to dismantle him. For 10 long seconds, the only sound in the auditorium was Steven Seagal's desperate, wheezing attempts to draw air back into his crushed lungs. Then, slowly, painfully, Seagull sat up. He rubbed his throat, his eyes still wide with shock. He looked up at Bruce Lee. There was no anger in Seagull's expression. The arrogance, the condescension, the theatrical challenge. It was all gone. Burned away in 7 seconds of absolute, terrifying efficiency. What remained in Seagull's eyes was something rare in the brutal world of martial arts. It was pure, unfiltered awe. Seagull struggled to his feet. His legs were shaking. He stood in front of Lee, looking down at the smaller man. The crowd waited for Seagull to say something, to make an excuse, to claim it was a trip, an accident. Seagull took a deep, shuddering breath. He straightened his GI, wiped the sweat from his face, and bowed. It wasn't a casual nod. It was a deep, formal, full-body Japanese bow of absolute submission and respect. When he rose, his voice was quiet, stripped of all ego, barely carrying to the front row. "You didn't fight my style," Seagull whispered, his voice hoarse. "You erased it. There is no defense against that." Bruce Lee looked at him. For the first time that morning, the faintest hint of a smile touched the corner of Lee's mouth. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of a fellow warrior who had just learned the most important lesson of his life. "It is not about erasing your style," Lee said softly, just loud enough for Seagull to hear. "It is about understanding that style is a cage. When you let go of the cage, you will understand what just happened to you." Lee turned his back on the giant, walked off the mat, picked up a small canvas bag from the third row, and walked toward the emergency exit. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, and nobody tried to stop him. Nobody asked for an autograph. They just watched him go, a ghost leaving the scene of a miracle. Steven Seagal stood alone in the center of the tatami mat for a long time. He didn't look at the crowd. He just looked down at his own hands, the hands that had been rendered useless by a man half his size. He stood there, recalibrating his entire understanding of combat, knowing that everything he had learned in Japan, all the brutal throws and joint locks, meant absolutely nothing if he couldn't touch the man he was trying to throw. The story of the Olympic Auditorium in July 1972 never made the newspapers. Seagull never spoke about it publicly, bound by the unspoken code of martial arts honor. But more importantly, bound by the profound humiliation of the moment. Yet, on those who were there that morning, 500 silent witnesses carried the story with them for the rest of their lives. They told their students told their students. It became an underground myth, a parable taught in dojos across the world. It is a story that proves a truth most fighters are too afraid to admit. Size is an illusion. Strength is a crutch. And when true mastery meets brute force, mastery doesn't just win. Mastery makes brute force question its own existence. 7 seconds. No punches thrown. A giant brought to his knees. That was the legacy Bruce Lee left on that hot Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. Not a fight, an education.